In the Vietnam War, victory was not only fought in the jungles, it was calculated in boardrooms. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and President Lyndon Johnson placed their faith in computers and systems like PIACCS and HES, believing that mountains of data could measure progress, manage the battlefield, and ultimately engineer success. Yet behind the charts, graphs, and statistics was a fatal illusion, a war reduced to numbers that ignored human reality. What followed was not clarity, but a quantified disaster that misled policymakers and justified strategies divorced from the ground truth. The Vietnam War became the testing ground for a new kind of warfare, one guided not by battlefield commanders but by computers and statistics. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and President Lyndon Johnson believed massive amounts of data could measure success and control the fight. Instead, their obsession with numbers created an illusion of progress, while the human and political costs. Mara earned his reputation at Ford Motor Company as one of the whiz kids, using statistics and systems analysis to streamline production and maximize profits. When he entered the Pentagon, he brought the same boardroom mindset into the business of war. To McNamara, battles were problems to be solved with charts, inputs, and measurable outcomes, an engineer's puzzle rather than a human struggle. He saw soldiers as data points, villages as entries on a scorecard, and success as something that could be optimized like an assembly line. What was efficient in Detroit quickly proved disastrous in Vietnam, where the enemy did not behave like a company, and human will could not be reduced to a formula. If PIACCS measured the war from Washington, HES claimed to measure it in the villages of Vietnam. Every Hamlet was scored on security, loyalty, and progress, as if the hearts and minds of millions could be translated into survey data. The system looked scientific, but in reality it rewarded inflated numbers and punished honesty. If PIACCS measured the war from Washington, the Hamlet Evaluation System, HES, claimed to measure it from the villages of Vietnam. Every Hamlet was graded like a school report card. Was it secure? Was it loyal? Was it improving? Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives, with all their complexity, were reduced to numbers on standardized forms. On paper, HES promised an objective picture of progress. In practice, it rewarded commanders for inflating their results. A Hamlet marked as pacified earned praise from higher-ups, even if the Viet Cong reclaimed it the next week. American officers pressured their South Vietnamese counterparts to deliver the right answers, while villagers often gave whatever responses they believed would keep them safest at the moment. The result was a massive database of information that looked convincing in Washington briefings, but bore little resemblance to the war anyone was actually fighting. For President Johnson, the numbers were more than analysis. They were political weapons. Each report provided impressive statistics that could be delivered to Congress and the American people to reassure them that progress was steady. Numbers justified budget requests, defended policies, and bought time. McNamara's systems fit perfectly with Johnson's obsession with appearing decisive and successful, yet this convenience came at a steep cost. Honest assessments from the field were buried when they contradicted the numbers. Officers who told the truth were sidelined, while those who provided optimistic figures were rewarded. The public was not being informed, it was being managed. The systems that were supposed to illuminate the war instead became tools of deception, sustaining a political narrative even as the battlefield realities worsened. For President Johnson, the numbers were more than analysis. They were political weapons. Each report provided impressive statistics that could be delivered to Congress and the American people to reassure them that progress was steady. Numbers justified budget requests, defended policies, and bought time. McNamara's systems fit perfectly with Johnson's obsession with appearing decisive and successful. Yet this convenience came at a steep cost. Honest assessments from the field were buried when they contradicted the numbers. Officers who told the truth were sidelined, while those who provided optimistic figures were rewarded. The public was not being informed, it was being managed. The systems that were supposed to illuminate the war instead became tools of deception, sustaining a political narrative even as the battlefield realities worsened. By the mid-1960s, the illusion of progress was complete. PIACCS showed money and resources being used with textbook efficiency. HES showed secure hamlets multiplying year after year. Body counts suggested the enemy was being worn down to the breaking point. To policymakers, the war was moving toward victory, but for the soldiers in the jungles and villages of Vietnam, this was a fantasy. They faced ambushes in areas that had been marked safe villages that were supposedly loyal, shifted allegiance the moment American forces withdrew. The enemy seemed endless, resilient, and determined. The numbers were not capturing Vietnam, they were concealing it. And as the war dragged on, the discrepancy between the reassuring graphs in Washington and the grim reality on the ground became harder to ignore. The Vietnam War revealed a central flaw of Cold War thinking, the belief that technology and management systems could solve problems that were at their core political and cultural. McNamara trusted computers and models more than commanders and diplomats. He believed a war could be understood through data inputs, bombing tonnage, supply lines, pacification scores, without grappling with the motives or resilience of the people fighting it. This faith in machines created a false sense of mastery. Computers could organize information at dazzling speed, but they could not ask whether the right questions were being posed or whether the inputs themselves were hollow. By treating technology as a savior, the United States invested in measuring a war it did not truly understand, ensuring that the answers were neat but meaningless. Behind every statistic lay human lives, lives that the numbers consistently distorted or ignored. Hamlets labeled pacified often endured night raids, forced relocations, or devastating bombardments. Civilians were miscounted as dead enemy fighters to make the charts look better. Soldiers were pressured to inflate their kill counts, knowing their careers depended on producing good numbers rather than sound results. The result was not only strategic failure but deep moral compromise. By reducing villages and people to data points, U.S. policy stripped away human reality and replaced it with abstractions. The suffering of civilians, the disillusionment of troops, and the collapse of trust between allies were all hidden behind a facade of numerical progress. The greatest tragedy was not only that the systems failed, it was that they dehumanized the very war they claimed to explain. Even before the war ended, sharp observers understood that PIACCS and HES had failed to deliver useful insight. Generals in the field complained privately that the systems produced numbers without meaning. Analysts began to realize that the flow of data was manipulated at every level to meet political expectations. Yet the machinery of quantification rolled on, because it served those at the top. More troubling still, these lessons were not learned for long. Decades later, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same reliance on metrics resurfaced. Villages secured, enemies killed, statistics of progress trotted out for public reassurance. Once again, charts took precedence over cultural understanding, and analysis became a mask for failure. Vietnam was not just a war America lost. It was a warning about the dangers of letting data substitute for truth, a warning America has too often ignored. The story of PIACCS and HES is not just about failed systems. It is about the arrogance of believing complex human realities can be reduced to numbers. McNamara and Johnson embraced these metrics because they promised certainty, control, and political cover, but the numbers were never neutral. They became tools that shaped policy, justified strategy, and prolonged a war that could not be won by statistics. In the end, computers and calculations blinded America to the war it was actually fighting. What looked like progress on a chart masked a deepening disaster on the ground. The lesson of Vietnam is clear. When leaders mistake data for reality, they risk turning war into a mathematical fiction, one that costs lives, squanders trust, and leaves only numbers to measure the depth of failure.